Hey, Shalom, and welcome to Wisdom in Torah Ministries. It's been a few weeks. I've been a little bit busy with some of the stuff that I've been doing, but I'm glad to be back with Professor Mark Chavalas, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How about yourself?
Uh-oh, wait a minute. It's been a few weeks. I don't like hearing my voice. It's annoying. How you doing, Professor?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing good, man. I had my time with my granddaughter. It was really good. Now I'm getting ready for my temple course coming up in about a week and a half. And busy studying a lot. I'm doing some deep research on Leviticus 17:11 about the word kippel, which is atonement. I found some cool stuff that I would love to run by you sometime
Yep.
in the New Testament, tracing the word ransom. And also, it's interesting. Remember the word aphesis I told you a long time ago?
Yeah.
Remission? Well, I found that it's connected with the word redeemed in
Right.
the New Testament, but that word redeemed actually means is used in the context in the Greek of when you're paying a ransom or money for a slave to set them free. And
Yeah.
it's quite interesting because now we know that we've been purchased, and the wages of sin is death. And now it makes sense, Leviticus 17:11, because the life is in the blood. That's another topic I want to discuss with you later. But this
Oh, yeah.
week, this week, I'm looking forward to this topic. Is are tattoos allowed in the Bible? There's a lot of controversy on this stuff.
Only only if they're Dodger decals, then they're okay. So I got my Dodger decal.
I knew you would say. I knew you were going to. I
Yeah.
knew it. That's funny, man. So Dodgers are doing okay. They're doing
Yeah,
okay.
second place. But yeah.
Well, I mean, it's still early. They can go to last place next month. You know
Yeah.
how baseball is. It's
Yeah,
not how
well,
you start it. It's not how you start, but how you finish.
it's all right. They have a better
You
record
know,
than the Yankees, so they're okay.
but the Yankees are always late bloomers. They always come in and they make everything difficult, and then all of a sudden, poof, they start doing the right thing. So, give
Yeah.
me 1 second. Keep saying a few things, and I'll be right here. Tell us a little bit about what you want to present.
Well, I obviously I want to look at tattoos, and about 10 years ago, an article came out by John Unigard, who was the Akkadian guy that we had discussed before. And he co-authored an article about tattoos in the ancient Near East in the Bible. And here's another place where Mesopotamia is going to be helping us understand biblical context. And so, really, all I'm going to be doing here, although it's still a pretty big deal, is tweaking our understanding of why there is a prohibition for tattoos. There obviously is a prohibition. There's no doubt about it. But the reason behind it is what I want to talk about. And I think that um, this is where this might be a good spirited discussion. And I'm going to guess it'll require a few responses here and there by people who are listening, and that'll be fun to see
That would
what they're
be, yeah, that would be kind of cool. Let me read Leviticus 18 because we're going to be focusing on chapter 19, verse 28, and examining that today.
Yeah.
And but let's contrast this with a command that God told the people of Israel when they're leaving Egypt and they're going into the promised land. Sometimes we're not really quite understanding the purpose of God's instructions when we see it isolated in one verse. But it is a command not to imitate the ways of the Gentiles. So watch this. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Well, let me share it. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, Leviticus 18, verse 1
Yeah.
through 5. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, speak to the Israelites, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not carry out the practices of the land of Egypt, in which you lived, and you must not carry out the practices of the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. And you must not follow their statutes. You must carry out my regulations, and you must observe my statutes by following them. I am the Lord your God, and you shall observe my statutes, my regulations, by which the person doing them shall live. I am the Lord. So let me ask you a question, and then you can go off there
Yeah.
as long as you want. Wouldn't you agree that the whole issue in chapter 19 is a result of God's commands to tell the people of Israel about holiness. It really is about the holiness code here, talking about
Right.
holiness and how you conduct yourself in the sexual behavior and also the worship behavior and also with your neighbor. Um, social justice, righteousness, and justice. And I see those things being covered within the chapter, 17, 18, 19, and 20.
Right. And of course, I certainly agree with that. And I think that the fact that it's put here, you have to decide, is this talking about what is now coming up in a minute? And of course, these are the sexual taboos, or is it talking across the board? And I'm thinking it's probably across the board. Obviously, God is doing these things. And of course, it's probably sexual intimacy where it's the most um, vulnerable place, where God's going to show that you people need to be uh, wholly apart and different from the nations, from that nation that you just came out of, Egypt, and from the nation that where you're going to dispossess, in Canaan. And so that's certainly true. And so you want to look at this in that context. And I want to look at even the passage on tattoos in that context too. It's spliced in between the sexual taboos of 18, and of course the penalties for those taboos in chapter 20. And then in 19 we have a lot of, I suppose we would call them miscellaneous laws,
Yeah.
because they when I look at them, I don't have an immediate understanding of why they're uh, put together the way they are. But of course, that's very typical in the whole ancient Near East, whether it's Hammurabi's laws or whether it's the biblical laws. They don't connect things the way that we connect things. We like to put things in, like maybe either sequential order or in type or whatever, but I don't think they're thinking that way. And if we sort of understand that, then we don't get bothered by it. However, when we get, there's only one time in the entire Bible there's a taboo against tattoos. Now that doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that there's only one time. It happens to be in the Levitical code here. And so um
Can I
I'm
read it real quick so we can?
yeah, of course. I
It's
suppose,
Leviticus 19:28.
but I think it might be good to start with 26
Okay,
and go down to even like 30. Just
got it.
put it in that 5 verse context.
It says, "You must not eat anything with the blood. You shall not practice divination, nor shall you interpret signs. You shall not round off the corners of your head, corner hairs of your head, and you shall not trim the corners of your beard. And you shall not make a slash on your body for the dead person. Nor shall you make your on yourselves a tattoo," which that word is true. That word is only mentioned once
Yeah,
in the
that's
whole
okay.
Bible.
Yeah.
And I am the Lord. And you shall not profane your daughters by making her prostitute, lest the land be prostituted and the land filled up with depravity. And you shall keep my Sabbath, and you shall revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Will you allow me to add something to this?
Yeah.
In my opinion, verse 30 is the key to understand everything above. And I'll tell you why. As you know, I'm a temple researcher. That's really what I've been doing for 25 years.
I heard. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed when I began to study a little bit of Egyptology and some of the Canaanite culture is that the political and the religious was intertwined, as well as in the Babylonian. Every country
Yeah.
is now the separation of states. That's something new, really, in history, because
Oh,
back
yeah.
in the day it was always together.
Well,
Um,
even the Pope was a head of state, or still is,
of course,
actually.
of course. Uh, for me, the key is in the Sabbath, because when you go to the temple protocol, I'm sorry, Sabbath and the revering of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
When you go to the temple protocol, let me give you some examples. Hopefully, this will be adding to the teaching. In that it says you you should not eat anything with blood. Well, in the Bible, the blood represents life. But in the apotropaic worship, it was representing other things, the underworld and different types of things. Also divination. In the temple, they will do the service in silence. And in the entrails, they will put it on the altar and burn them. And I always wonder why. Until you read the book of Ezekiel, and they're reading the liver. So as you know, Balaam, when he built the 7 altars, he is doing sacrifice, but he says there's no divination against Israel. Why? Because the text is telling you something without telling you what's going on. And, like you talk about this all the time. If he's doing the sacrifices and he's a false prophet, they will do divination. So he's reading the liver and nothing is being seen. So I think the previous verses 26, cutting of the hair, the priest cannot have long hair. The longest you can go was 30 days because it was a mourning ritual. So I think all of this stuff is based on that verse 30, is connecting the holiness of God and his Shabbat, but also the reverence of the tabernacle and the worship and what God defines as holiness. And I think tattoos, as we continue to investigate more what they were all about, maybe will fit in the whole scheme of things there.
And I would agree with that, except that when I look at the pagan cultures around Israel, tattooing only has one purpose, and it's the mark of slavery. And that's going to be my argument here. And
right.
And because of that, and by the way, this is where I'm going to ask for help from you. I want to go back in Leviticus 19 for a second, because I want to see how things are interconnected. I think in some cases they're interconnected in a subtle way. So let's go up to 19:3 for a second.
Okay.
We haven't read it yet. So 19:3, each of you must revere your mother and your father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. And then, of course, I am the Lord your God. Now,
right.
Okay, now my discussion is this. Clearly, in a theoretical mode, I can revere my mother and father without keeping the Sabbath, and I can revere the Sabbath without revering my mother and father. Obviously, you shouldn't. I'm not saying that it's a ridiculous theoretical issue. You should be doing both.
I got you.
But they're not dependent upon each other.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And because of that, the mere fact that the two of them are together doesn't mean that they have an interconnectedness to each other. In other words, I can keep the Sabbath without revering my parents, and I can revere my parents without keeping the Sabbath. And so what I'm saying about that is that their mindset is a little different than ours. When we put something in a sentence, we expect that those things are interconnected in a way. Then you go down a little bit further. Let's see. Where else did I want to go? How about 16?
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Now, so I got the New American Standard. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. You are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Again, those two items are not interconnected. And those, I can do one without the other and vice versa. And so what I'm saying is that just the mere fact that they are put together doesn't mean that they are dependent upon each other in terms of a law, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then I can continue looking at a lot of the laws in the same way. If I go down to 30, and maybe this is where you're going to have a different opinion, and I want to hear this. If you go down to 30, which you just read, is it possible to keep the Sabbath and not revere the sanctuary? You know what I'm saying is that can you do one without the other?
Well, I mean, we're doing that now.
Well, that's what yes, of course. And so what I'm saying that they are not dependent upon each other. I mean, they are in some respects. Obviously, when do you revere the sanctuary? It's on the Sabbath. But
yeah, because the word revere is yereah, which means to honor.
Yes. Okay. So that one isn't probably in other words, you could see a subtle interconnected to them, but for the most part, these seems to be laws that are put together. I don't want to say, I'm going to say this word, but I don't mean it in a disrespectful way. They look to the Westerners if they're put together in a haphazard way, like, all right, why did you put this and this together? And I think and this shows me that the Israelites have the same thinking patterns as the rest of the ancient Near East. How are they different? They're different because they're worshiping the true God, and the true God has set them apart in very particular ways. And those are the ones that are being discussed, especially in sexual customs in 18 through, in 20.
You know
And
what I see here real quick in
yeah,
chapter 19,
yeah,
on that verse 3 that you were talking about,
yes.
revering, is the Hebrew word tira'u.
So it's
And
different. Okay.
I'm going to read from the commentary that I have here. Let me go here. This commentary is the Koran I showed you earlier. It's the Koran Tanakh of the land. It's a Jewish source, but everything within here is also ancient Near East and history and archaeology.
Here's my three
And
milligram volumes over there.
Milgram, good stuff, right?
Of course, the best.
I tried reading the whole chapter 19. Oh, Lord. It's technical. It's technical. It
Yeah,
says, what does it mean to revere one's mother and father elsewhere? The same verb is used to mean fear, while in the
yeah,
Ten Commandments, we're told to honor our parents. Kedushim 30b, the Talmud, Kedushim 30b points out that both of these verbs are used in relation to God, like in Deuteronomy 6:13 and Proverbs 3:9, as well as parents. And then it gives you Akkadian, which you like. Akkadian uses a semantically equivalent verb, palahu, I think it
yeah,
is,
yes,
fear,
yes,
in the same way. Hebrew
exactly.
uses yarea, both for something one may be frightened or for reverence
Yes,
of the religious kind directed towards God or parents. So the service in the temple will be reverence towards his service and his sacred space. And parents, it says, at least once it is directed as an adaptive parent together with kabatu, the Akkadian equivalent of Hebrew of
yes,
kavod, which is honor.
right. Yeah,
The latter term, at least, is used specifically for housing, feeding, and dressing infirm parents. Both in
uh,
Akkadian and Hebrew,
yeah.
reverence for parents will seem to imply much more than simply providing for their physical needs. I actually, and you know what, that makes sense, because when you see the structure here, you see righteousness and justice,
Yes.
taking care of the needy, the homeless, and the widows, all put together.
No, and I agree that there is a structure to it. It's not always easy to see. By the way, that term kabatu in Akkadian, like kavod, the original meaning is fat,
Oh,
and big and fat,
uh-huh.
and a heaviness to it. And of course, then it becomes
Right.
an abstract. The abstract meaning is that something that is important and heavy. I
It's
suppose
like
like
the it's like
driving.
the liver in Hebrew. It says the kavod.
Yeah,
Like the Hebrew, like the liver, heavy like the liver.
yeah. So anyway, so now with that as a context, let's now go to 1928 for a second.
Okay.
Okay. And this is the argument. And by the way, this is not, I'm not original in this. In fact, 90% of what I tell you is not original, but that's the whole point of studying, I suppose, is you're learning something. So here we got in 1928.
It says, and you
Well,
shall not make a slash in your body
yeah,
for a dead person, which by the way, the Iraqis do that to this day.
yeah,
They
you're
cut
right.
themselves for Ali, their prophet. And
Yeah.
it says, nor shall you make on yourselves a tattoo mark. I am the Lord.
Now, tattoos have been assumed, and I think this is probably from rabbinical times, because of course, when do we first begin to have commentaries? I suppose you could say that Chronicles is a slight commentary on Kings, but other than that, for the most part, when we look at how to interpret Leviticus, they're not interpreting it for centuries later. In other words, the first interpretations we have of them are the rabbinical commentaries, most of which are obviously in the Christian era. But the point is that they have
Wait,
a
you need to mention that again because that is actually very true. I'm sorry to interrupt you here.
yeah,
Turn
no,
around.
actually,
Will you turn around and point out to Milgram's volumes for me?
yeah,
Those
one, two,
three volumes are, for the audience who doesn't know, those are the gold standards commentaries on the book of Leviticus. And the guy who wrote them was a conservative rabbi, Jacob Milgram.
oh,
I recently, I got some friends in Israel, few of them are rabbis, and I asked them, hey, how come, you know, why is it that I have not been able to find, maybe there is, I haven't seen it in Hebrew, a in-depth study in the book of Leviticus like Milgram did? And there isn't. I mean, you have Menachot in the Talmud and some of the other tractates that talk about the book of Leviticus, but I'm talking about concise, verse by verse research. There really isn't any. And then I
Yeah.
was told by a friend of mine in Israel, we had a really open conversation about this. And he says, well, in the even the yeshiva, the book of Leviticus is not necessarily taught verse by verse. It's covered within the Mishnah text and some of the Talmud, but in regular secular schools, they don't teach Leviticus anymore, for what I understand
Yeah.
today.
I
Now,
believe.
the same thing is in the Christian church. As you know,
Oh,
Leviticus not even touched.
yeah. Of course not. And so when I say of course not, it's because of how hard it is. Well, you think, but the commitment this fellow made, as you well know, this
Yeah,
is well over a decade of his life and probably more. And it's also the Anchor Bible commentary is so thick because most of his notes are embedded in the middle of his prose. And so it's a really, really difficult read unless you're looking for something. You don't just crack out a Leviticus commentary
no.
by Milgram to sit and read for pleasure. Well, maybe Rico does, but there's
Man, I
nobody.
read that. Hey, I read that all. I read all those volumes, and I don't remember half of it. It was so technical. I'm thinking, what is he talking about? And that was like about 14 years ago. And I'm revisiting them again, and now I'm starting to get an idea because I'm reading some of his students, work based on his work. So it's crazy advanced. He was 30 years on that on Leviticus.
Yes, and of course, now that you're connected to one of his students, one of his last students, Roy Gain,
Yeah,
uh, he's probably going to make you drown in more Milgram. But if you look at the second volume, and if you look at what Milgram says about this verse, he anticipates the idea that this probably has a different meaning than
right.
what what we've normally assumed. We normally assumed, and I think for good reason, by the way, the rabbinical commentaries and also the early church fathers, for once they're in agreement with each other about this. When you look at 28, they assume that the cutting of the body for the dead and making tattoo marks it's not that they're the same thing, but they're both doing it in a mourning ritual.
Right.
In
That's the
other words,
assumption.
yes. And there's no, and you know why? It's because the way that we categorize things in the modern Western world comes from our friend Aristotle. In other words, we think like Greeks. We can't help it. We order things like the Greek world. And of course, in the rabbinical tradition, uh, they of course did a really, especially the Pharisees did a really good job in trying to block Hellenism from coming in, but a lot of the generic Hellenism came in, and you can see it with Paul,
Yeah.
um, thinking the mentality of a Greek way, and so they would look at this passage and they would assume, oh, Leviticus about tattoos is a mourning ritual, guilty by association. In other words, it's in the same sentence, so it must be a mourning ritual. Um,
So
and
can I show a picture that I showed you earlier? Maybe the people can
yeah,
understand the direction that we're going. If you let me read this particular commentary and show this, is that okay?
yeah, I'll fall
All
asleep if it's a commentary, but go ahead.
right. um, it's about the word tattoo, right?
Yeah,
And it's basically says it occurs only in Leviticus
yeah,
19:28. You already read that.
yeah,
But then as I'm reading through, right, I went to do some research
yeah.
in
Gordon went.
Egyptology.
Yeah,
Then I found, hopefully the audience can see this. But then I found this and I looked it up in different sources. First, it explains why the priests needed to wear the garments all the way to their ankles because this was a priest of the Egyptian in the temple of Karnak, and they're almost halfway naked. But they have the god carved on the chest. As and you talked about the sign of ownership, and I agree with you on that, slavery.
yes,
But like in the book of Ezekiel, 8:4 talks about, the tav being put on the forehead so the believers has protection, right?
yeah,
But there will be like a sign of ownership. So,
yes, yes,
so could it be possible that the message is don't put the tattoos because then you will be like a slave. You don't
yes.
want,
That that's my ultimate conclusion, and of course it's ownership. Um, let's that Hebrew word, by the way, we're assuming it's talking about some sort of incision, in other words, that you're writing, but we don't know for sure what the word is, but it almost doesn't matter. It's
Right.
clearly some sort of body marking that's permanent. Although even then it implies permanence, I suppose, because of course if I, write on my arm and I can wash it off, that's, you know, that's a nothing. So anyway, and by the way, that commentary that you just looked at, if you go back to it for a second, there's an
Sure.
interesting, I was going to bring this up, but it came up. It came
What is
up
it?
with
Go
Gordon
ahead.
Wenham, who wrote a nice commentary on
What?
Leviticus. There's Wenham here, just a couple lines down.
Yeah.
Wenham comments, man is not to disfigure the divine likeness implanted to him by scarring his body. And that's his Leviticus commentary, page 272. That sounds like a really good thing, but uh, and it seems like a nice argument, except that I don't think it's a biblical argument. I'm not saying that you should tattoo yourself. I'm just saying that this has been a typical evangelical Christian argument for not um, tattooing themselves is because God made you in His image, and so why would you scar your body? And of course, I think that can be easily argued is that why are people poking themselves with holes for earrings or you think about it, there are two places, and maybe we can go to Exodus 21 for a second.
Yeah.
Uh,
Talking about the when they're building the altar.
well, no, at the beginning of Exodus 21, when the slave uh,
Oh yeah, the owl.
yeah, well, and by the way, this is definitely a Hebrew slave. It's not a non-Israelite. So this
Correct.
is I think it's fascinating that the word Hebrew is used here rather than Israelite.
Right.
There's probably a meaning for it. I haven't studied it to figure out what it means. But the fact that at some point in verse 6, he decides that he will have his ear pierced with an awl. And so that's a permanent marking. And what's it for? It's a mark to show that he is now permanently, even though it's willing, he is willing to permanently be attached to this family.
Right. And it was
And
done at the threshold, which was the legal way
yeah.
of allowing to come into the house.
And by the way, if you look at verse 6 there,
Yeah.
I know you want to go to an interlinear, but that word for God there is, I think there's a difficulty whether it's yeah,
Judges.
but it's the word Elohim. It's
Right.
not judges. And
Right.
so,
Which would it would imply the judges.
well, yeah, now, for example, my friend Mike Heiser argued, no, when it says Elohim, it means Elohim. It means heavenly being or God. Uh,
See?
uh, and it's also, but the problem is it's plural there. And so,
Right.
what's going on here?
The
Um,
Net Bible has judges on it.
right. No, I know. And so,
Yeah.
but the word, the literal meaning, of course, is, yeah, Elohim. Then you go to, uh, and of course, we're getting off base, but of course, our whole study is a tangent. So, but then you go to Deuteronomy 15, and so here's the updated, the generation later, in chapter 15.
What verse?
What is 15, 17? It's pretty much the same thing going on here. If you start with verse 12,
Can I
uh,
read it?
yeah, yeah,
And your relative, if your relative who is a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman is sold to you, he or she has served you 6 years, then in the seventh year you shall send that person out free. And when you send him out free from you, shall not send him away empty handed. You shall generously supply him from among your flock, and from your threshing floor, and from your press, according to that which with which God, the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall give him. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt.
yeah,
For the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I am commanding you thus today. And then if it will happen that he says to you, I do not want to go out from you, because he loves you and your family, because it is good for him to be with you, then you shall take an owl, and you shall thrust it through his earlobe in the door, and it shall be to you a slave forever. and you should also do likewise for your slave woman.
Yeah. Now, what is interesting there, when the owl is used there, there's no Elohim, which people have tried to argue, well, something's going on differently here a generation later, where you don't have to go to the sanctuary or the judges or whoever it might be. It can be done on an
Do,
individual basis. So I
do
don't
you
know.
think maybe because it's already understood in the previous law as a precedent that you have
Maybe,
to go to them?
maybe.
Okay.
Um, that's anybody's guess. Um, so anyway, what I'm saying is that by looking at these passages, the marking itself is not necessarily. I mean, we have to try to find what the reason is. It's obvious that it's a taboo. There's no doubt about it. The reason behind it is, and of course, in this day and age, as you well know, and obviously, even with people who come to faith, they are already living in a culture where a tattoo is very common now. When I was a little kid, the only people that were tattoos were, sailors and motorcycle gang members, scary people. But now, of course, anybody, a housewife or, anybody who wants to get
Yeah.
tattooed. So it's a cultural norm. And so it's actually hard to find people, especially in typical, non-denominational churches where people aren't full of tattoos. And of course, they think nothing about it, and there's a prohibition. Well, that's the old prohibition.
Well, remember that, with the mindset that the law is done away with, they don't see the relevancy. And the New Testament really doesn't mention it because they didn't have to. The
No,
audience already understood these things.
yeah, yes. And so anyway, uh, now, before I go to Mesopotamia, and of course, you know these passages in Isaiah, which now when I go here in Isaiah 44 to start with, it's clearly poetry, and so it's not talking about a cultural norm, but the mere fact that Isaiah can sing this, the
44
Isaiah
what?
44, what is it, 5? Yeah, 44, 5 to start with. You know, um,
Yeah.
let's see. Yeah, okay, 44, 5. Um, so now God's being very tender at this point when through Isaiah, if you look at, at the beginning of 44, yeah, not quite there yet. Okay, so
I got it.
yeah, all right. So, you go to 44, 1, God's talking to Jacob, my servant. Of course, the word servant is really literally slave. And so I've chosen you from the womb. Do not fear, O Jacob. I'm just, I'll, verse 3, I'll pour out my water on thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I'll pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants. They will spring up among the grass like poplars by streams of water. I got the New American Standard, but it's similar. Then, of course, you 5. This one will say, I belong to Yahweh, and that one will be called by the name of Jacob, and another will write on his hand Yahweh's and take the name of Israel. So there, of course, this is branding, but it's for a good reason. In other words, look at me, I'm Yahweh's. I can prove it. It's on my hand.
But
Um,
do you think that's it makes sense because he begins the verse with, but now here Jacob, my servant. It's only logical because
yeah.
only servants have the branding of ownership from their
Yes.
owners.
Right. And so now, by the way, this isn't negating anything. It simply means that this might be a hint as to what the true meaning of branding is. If it's for servitude, then I don't think the passage is saying, well, now that you understand that it's servitude, go ahead and get a brand with my name on it. Which, by the way, some evangelical Christians will actually do. They'll put, a divine name on their arm or
That's crazy. I mean,
yeah.
one of the things that I learned a long time ago is about what holiness is. And in the Western world, we have this really warped understanding of what holiness is. They assume it's something external, but they don't understand what the Hebrew word is kedusha, is holiness. Like the name is holy. So the Jews are very adamant about protecting the holiness of the name. And people assume in the West that they don't want to pronounce it. It's just that's not the point. The point is that it's holy, so they are careful when and how they use it. That's really what it is, time and space. And
Yeah.
when they put it in their hand, it's like that's the holy name of God in your own arm. It's like, oh wow, based on these verses, which I think are wrongly interpreted.
No, I agree. I think there's a much bigger picture to it, and so I wouldn't even consider it, at all. Then you could, but there's one other passage in Isaiah which is is about God. This is 49, uh,
49 what?
14 through 16.
Okay, I'm there.
So, so this one is even, I think, is frankly more interesting. So, here's God, thing, but here's Zion saying, Zion representing Israel, Yahweh has forsaken me and the Lord has forgotten me. And of course, they're feeling that way because events have not happened the way they wanted to. And here's God saying, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forgive you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of, well, obviously my hands. Uh, and so the point of that is that it's God is now acting in the analogy like a mother, where do you think I could forget my own child? And
Yeah.
so the imagery is you're right on my hand. I see you every time I move my hand. There you are. To remind me. Obviously, this is imagery to help us understand that God's always got us on His mind.
So I got a question then about that. So
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine. I think you know who she is because I've done podcasts with her,
Yes.
Dina Dye, and we're
Yeah.
covering biblical genres. And so what you're suggesting basically in your comments is that we read this and sometimes people take it literally, when in
Yes.
fact is there imagery or metaphors or things that God is trying to convey His message was something that they would have understood back then.
Yes. I agree. And so I mean I would never use this to say, well, it's okay now because God did it with me. Well, so I can do it. I would never want to go that far and
Right.
say I think it's. But anyway,
But wait. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor.
yeah,
But that's a really good point that I want to kind of expound on because in the Western world, you've been to Syria and you've been there. You deal with the culture, and
yeah,
you have the advantage. I've gone to Israel a lot, Turkey and Greece, so I got to deal with those people in the East.
yeah,
Um, you know, we have such a big disconnection
yeah,
with the mindset and the way they function. Maybe that's why the Western world and the religion is so removed for the lack of understanding of the cultural background.
yeah. It. And what does it do when we understand the cultural background? I guess we'll just keep on saying it till our head falls off. It provides a context for better understanding it. And once in a
Yeah.
while, and it might even change meaning, but like even this one here, this is going to tweak my meaning. It's not going to overhaul it.
Oh, I
Okay.
see. Yeah, makes sense.
And
Yeah.
this is what's going on here. So now, um, so with that, and and on a personal level, I have obviously in my Christian community, there's an overwhelming percentage of people who have marked their bodies, either before they came to faith or even afterwards, by the way. And so, when I look at it, I have to look at it in the same way if I think that they're theologically incorrect about something. I can speak the truth, but then I have to also say, I do not know what your heart is behind it. And so I'm going to allow you and God to have your conscience issue, and I'm going to tell you what I think. And then I'm going to say, now you and God are the ones that are going to have to deal with this particular thing.
Do,
You
do
know,
you think, do you think on that point, do you think that not embracing um, the understanding of the whole scripture allows that person to maybe be perceived in that perception and that way you just mentioned because of the lack of understanding and the ignorance to some of the commandments?
yes,
But like,
yes,
but the Jewish people, the people of the book, in which these things were given to, I could understand why a Gentile would get a tattoo.
yes,
Because if we were going to be logical, it's something that Milgram mentions.
yeah,
If we're going to be logical, the command was given to Israel,
yeah,
not to the nations.
That's
So
right.
in my case, that I grafted myself into the nations, and every Christian that says we're grafted in, then that means that those things apply to them as a instruction foundational thing. So the moment you come into a covenantal relationship, as you know, I'm talking to one of the experts in covenant in the ancient Near East, you are supposed to come onto the banner of that covenantal authority. And I think by not teaching these things to them, we can feel the sympathy of, I want to measure your heart now today in not understanding these principles. But then what do we say when we try to explain it to them in its context and now they continue to move in that direction?
All I can say is that um, I know I've got my own blind spots that are
Right?
gonna be revealed. And now, obviously, this is not the time and a place to talk about that whole covenant issue and what we're grafted into. You and I have
Yeah,
already
yeah.
had the beginning
We
of that
talked about it.
discussion.
Yeah.
So, and that'll be fun to continue that discussion. But uh, but so it is a personal issue. How do I deal with someone like that? And of course, if for me, if I want to use the mind of Christ, it's now acting with the mind of Christ because it's much too easy to answer out of knowledge and not wisdom.
Can I push on that a little bit?
Yeah.
It's something that I got that phrase from you, by the way. I want you guys in the audience to know that, just like when my teacher Joseph Good and also my friend and my teacher Mark Chavalas, what I really enjoy about talking with them about these tough issues is that there's always a conversation and a dialogue. And we understand we may be in different places and different place, but we know that we're trying to understand the Bible to the best of our abilities with all the information that we have. My issue in regards to the little bit of a pushback, I understand that the ignorance is blitz at times. I get it. And I understand also that 90% of the audience may not know. As you know, I was in a regular church recently teaching on a Sunday. And one of the things that I tell my students, I'm able to adapt with the audience knowing they may not understand or not aware of some of the information. They
Yeah.
want to understand, they're just not exposed to the level that we are trying to study because that's what we do. But I can still say what I need to say without compromising my values.
Oh, yes, of
And I
course.
think when you start dealing with tattoos, and I guarantee you, anyone who has tattoos and goes to church, they know that the Bible restricts it. Now comes the excuses. Okay, so fine. Maybe
Yep.
you got some tattoos before you came into the faith. Got it. My father got them back in the 40s.
Yeah.
When he was alive, my father got tattoos when you said it was for hoodlums and
Yeah.
gang members. And he told me, he goes, he was the first one in his family to have them. And when he got them done, it was not because it was decorations. It was actually in gangs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
My father used long sleeves his whole life
Yeah.
after I was born because of the shame of having tattoos and the
Yeah.
perception people had. Understand, he lived in Puerto Rico. It's 96 degrees all the
Oh,
time.
yeah. Yeah.
So he refuses to wear
Yeah.
short sleeves because he didn't want to shame me as his son. That's why I
Yeah.
never got them because I saw what he
Sure.
went through, and also
Yeah.
when I found out the Torah says no, then obviously. But anyway. So, but what about those people who go to, let's say, to go to a church, they know the Bible restricts it, and then they get a tattoo not for decoration or whatever, but to honor a dead. There's a fine line that we have
Oh,
to,
yeah.
you know.
Now, I have a friend who did that, and again, it's wisdom. How do I bring this up with them in a way that will draw them to me rather than apart from me? And of
Yeah,
course,
that's a
all
challenge.
and it is our challenge because
Yeah.
it's the first thing I feel like, what's the matter with you, you knucklehead? I can't believe you did that, blah, blah, blah. And of course, who did I just try to uplift myself at that?
Uh-huh.
And I'm a, that happens so often. And so how do you do it in a way that will draw them to you with God's mind? And that's much harder than simply speaking the truth in love, as Paul says in Ephesians. So anyway,
I don't have
look,
a problem. Look,
yeah,
I'm going to be transparent here. I've always loved tattoos. I've
yeah,
always did. I still do. I
yeah,
don't do that because The Bible says not to. So I
Yes.
put my will aside and I want to obey God. But that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy a really good tag. You know, I've seen some tattoos. I go, well, that's really nice. That has nothing to do with the dead. It's just a
Yes.
really nice. So I could admire the work, but I don't do it or condone it because we live different values. But
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit here and judge everyone. Say, hey, you're going to go to hell now. That's
No.
not the point.
No.
But I don't do them because I'm convinced and like you said, I have more of the understanding of what this means. So I choose to do what the Bible tells me. But I'm not going around and judging everybody who has one, unless it's someone who knows better. There was a
Yeah.
person that I knew for years, knew better, understood what we knew, walked in what we did. For some reason, her husband passed away. Her husband passed away. We mourn his loss.
Yeah.
And then she got a tattoo. And I'm
Mm.
going like, where did that come from? I was
Yeah.
more disappointed because in order to live her life after the death of her husband, she compromised her values. And that was the disappointment.
Yeah.
That I mean, what happened when you were married? Why didn't you do it then? You know what I mean? It's like it seems like two different people altogether, and that was to me concerning.
And then, of course, you have to look at it and say, probably that was so much deep pain that this was a way
Right.
to assuage that pain rather than going to God. Who knows what's in our mind and heart? And we have to say, yeah, that, that could have been me,
God is faithful, man. I tell you, I don't know. I don't know how the Lord does it.
yeah, you're right. We don't know how he does it because we can't think that way. It's too hard for us.
Yeah.
So now, anyway, with all of this here, uh, I want to go to Mesopotamia for the time that we have. We have some time left still. It's just to
Okay.
talk about the fact that once once I read the article by Unigard that I sent you, I realized, oh, they didn't give a lot of examples about it. And in the last decade or so, there's been an explosion of examples about the slave marking in Mesopotamia, a little bit in Egypt, but like I said, it's almost always in Egypt. And so I'm going to just look at some of the things. When you look at mourning rituals, by the way, and we have some of the Canaanite rituals, although the Canaanite rituals are a problem. The mourning rituals are primarily in a mythological context, and so it doesn't necessarily always translate down to the human agencies. And they might even have cutting, like it says in Leviticus 19, but they don't have tattooing. In other words, you don't tattoo
Right.
yourselves
The
for the
story of Elijah tells you how the prophets of Baal will cut themselves. Yes.
yes, yes. And but it's interesting because there are in rabbinical tradition. I can't remember where, but I can look it up. In fact, I have another nice little article by uh, a Jewish fellow who who looked at rabbinical commentaries, and of course, one of the arguments was, I think, the pagans uh, they they as long as they don't mark themselves with a divine name, whether it's our God or any God, it's okay. They're all right. But once they put down something religious, that's bad. Now, this was their intellectual way of interpreting it. Maybe I'll even send it to you. This is a nice article in the journal The Torah, which you well know. David Bernat wrote a nice little article, and you can get it online in a second. But
Well, actually, that actually makes sense because you mentioned that if the name of God, and we already know the Tav, which is like the cross or the letter Tav in the Hebrew, in the book
yeah,
of Ezekiel, which was placed on people's foreheads, and the book of Revelation with
yeah, yes,
144,000. So it only makes sense to a Jewish guy to say that because putting the name and now set him aside because a kedusha, your whole you have the name, the holy name of God, so you cannot do. There are restrictions. Let me give you an example of this. The high priest, they have the head, the crown,
yes,
and he is only holy as a high priest when he had the priestly garments and he put the crown. It says kadosh la Adonai. The moment he put on the crown, he's representing the whole nation
yes,
as
yeah,
holy.
yeah. That makes
So
sense.
it makes sense why he would say that.
Yeah. Now, a couple Mesopotamian examples, because this once reading Unigard Unigard's article made me now look into Mesopotamia, and there's been two really big articles that I did not send you because they're ridiculously um, technical with Sumerian and Akkadian stuff in them. But the fellow wrote about branding in early Mesopotamia, and then that was in 2018. And another woman wrote an article in 2016. So it's been in the last couple of years about body language and Mesopotamian tattooing. So it's now sort of on the radar now. And
Gotcha.
so for example, I'm going to read a portion of a text. This is actually from the Sumerian period, so third millennium, like 2100. It's a list of POWs, and it says 2 Sumerian women, 1 boy not branded, 13 girls branded, 1 girl not branded, 1 boy not branded, 14 girls branded, and it's going over. In other words, some of them are branded, some of them aren't yet. And the point is that the assumption is that's what branding is. And by the way, branding here is some sort of marking that you either do with a hot, so like a real brand, or some sort of incision, whatever it is, it's unpleasant. And where do they do it? They usually will do it in a place where it can be seen, either on the arm, behind the ear. And of course, here's the problem. If I'm a Mesopotamian and I have a servant and I brand him, what happens if I need to sell the guy? They have to put another brand on it over the other brand, but all of them are markings. And so I have dozens of these types of examples, so I'm not going to read them all, but I wanted to read a couple that I thought were interesting. This one has the brand of a king. He has a boat brand. I don't know what a boat brand is. Maybe the boatman owns him. Then this one I thought was really interesting. This is, in fact, is Victor Horowitz, who wrote a lot of articles connecting. He's obviously was an Israeli.
Yeah,
but,
good writer.
Oh yeah, brilliant. He's talking about sentences from Sumerian to Akkadian, and in the sentences in this one list, he has he made him a chain, he made him pass over something, and then it says, quote, this is incised on his face. This one is a runaway, capture him. In other words, I'm a slave, I ran away, I came back, and now they're going to write a sentence on my forehead. If you find me, bring me back to so and so, at this address, which would have been horribly painful. And you know where else you find it? By the way, they find star-shaped brands in the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. You look up the word for star, kakabu, in Akkadian, and there are star-shaped brands.
Right.
With people. Usually, in other words, it's because you're a temple slave, and so I've got the name of Ishtar branded on me. So in other words, if I get out, everyone knows I'm a devotee of Ishtar because it's either on my forehead or
just like we saw the god of the Egyptians, in the chest.
Yeah, that's interesting. I obviously don't know enough about it, so I'd have to write to Jim Hoffmeyer or somebody, but I'm wondering how common it was for the priest to actually do the marking. In other words, it's idealistic to have it in my funerary relief.
Right.
But would I do it on my real person? I don't know.
Well, but now it makes sense, because if they came out of Egypt and they're going to go in an area like Canaan, which had a lot of access, people going through from Mesopotamia, from the Hittites, if they're going to go travel through the Via Maris or the King's Highway, it's only logical that the commandments to make a distinction between God's people and the nations will be distinct with things that they already understood, they already knew.
Yeah.
I mean, so can I read you something here from the commentary on the Tanakh from the Jewish source, is saying, the verse here, therefore, stands out in its negative assessment of tattooing that perhaps reflects the attitude towards other forms of permanent body marking, such as branding. Okay. Israelites mark permanent Hebrew servants. We talked about that in Exodus.
Yep.
But in Mesopotamia, especially in the first century BCE, slaves were branded or marked. Exactly what you were talking about. Slaves could also receive the second mark if they rebel or ran away. Just what you said.
Exactly.
But I wanted to read this part. Ibn Ezra, which is a very well-known rabbi, also understood ka'aka, which is the word for tattooing here in Leviticus, to mean branding. So he actually understands the word tattoo. So even though also the Jewish people and the rabbis believed that it was more in the context of branding more so than just, a name or something.
Yeah, it's what, and of course, what is a tattoo? It could be a brand, it could be a
Right.
writing or whatever, and maybe we can
Like the
even,
Dodger brand.
yeah, yeah. So in 1944, Oppenheim actually wrote an article about a young woman. She's an Aramean woman, and her father branded her with the name of Scribe on it. And so she's an Aramean scribe, oddly enough. In fact, it says here the father has written an inscription that she had the status of Sapiru. That's the Hebrew word for scribe also,
Right.
which Nupta, the judges and the city officials have entrusted to a certain person. And it says, delivered to the officials of the temple Aeana. So in other words, he put the title scribe on his daughter, which basically upped her status. Now, can you be a temple scribe and a servant? Yeah, but you're an upper class servant. There's all sorts of different classes of slaves, and so this would be a good one. Um, but I was just fascinated that, and yes, there are female scribes once in a while too. Um,
So if based on what you're saying, so there's a positive, if there's such a thing, based on Ezekiel 9:4, which is the angel in Jerusalem, branding really the letter Tav on the servants, and you have the 144,000, 12,000 of each of the they're being sealed with the so it
yeah,
okay, in the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem, there's a whole gallery about seals. And that
yeah,
was really fascinating to me because it was a sign of authority, ownership, and kingship. In other words, you're branded by your God. So would you consider the seal of the Holy Spirit in Ephesians? We're sealed, so we belong to God.
I would think that the analogy fits.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. But you're right. I wouldn't go so far as to say, well, now that God has sealed me with his spirit, I can do it too. No,
Right. No, no, that's right.
that's God's purview. It's really interesting thinking about that Ezekiel 9 passage, which I had failed to put in my little note here. Why is God having them do it? Go to the midst of the city, even though in the midst of Jerusalem, put a mark on the foreheads of the men with a sign and groan all over the abominations which are being committed. So that looks like it's a mourning, they're doing it for mourning there.
Which is kind of weird because it was not allowed.
Yes, but you think about it, Ezekiel, God, how do I say this? It looks as if God has Ezekiel do a lot of things that seem pretty counterintuitive, to say the
Hmm.
least. And that, and sometimes it's for effect. Like, I'm going to have him do something that's going to blow your mind. You're going to wake up when you see this. Um, well, you think about it. Is it really different than God asking Abram to go into, to Moriah and sacrifice, and to offer his son? Like, what? That's the craziest thing on earth that you would expect him to do. I don't know. That's just thinking out loud, which of course I
Yeah.
never. So two other ones I'll bring up, and then we can um, discuss it. Matthew Stolper has an article inscribed in Egyptian. Now, even though it's in Egypt, it's during the period of Xerxes the first, Ahasuerus himself. This is probably pre-Esther, by the way, but in the city of Sippar, which is near Babylon, was thousands of cuneiform tablets during his period. By the way, Xerxes didn't like Babylon. They rebelled against him, and they actually had two Nebuchadnezzars. In other words, two guys who claimed to be the new Nebuchadnezzar, and he squelched it. But here's a person who sold another servant to somebody, their slave woman, whose wrist is inscribed in Egyptian. In other words, normally if I'm living in Babylonia, if I got a servant, I'm going to write an Akkadian, cuneiform.
Yeah.
Well, here's a woman whose had something inscribed in Egyptian, which means it's probably become a normative custom by the 5th century, even though I don't think it was normative earlier in Egypt, which I thought was fascinating. And then the last one, based upon our last interview, which was about, of course, the Judean, the deportees, this is text number 52 in that list that I gave you from that book by Laurie Pierce on the Judean text. And in this one, Ikisha, son of Barak Il, voluntarily sold to Shalumu, the daughter of Hanan, Anna Muhinana Taklak, his slave woman, whose right hand is inscribed with the name Barak Il, her former owner. So even Jews, and by the way, Barak Il clearly is Baruch. I mean, that's the Akkadian, they're Akkadianizing of it, Baruch Il, so that, blessed, of God. And so these are clearly Jewish individuals who are passing a slave between them. And I don't know whether the slave woman is a Hebrew or not, probably not. By her name, although that doesn't necessarily always tell me something. But they basically they're transferring a slave over. She has the marking of the previous owner. They're probably going to rebrand her.
Yeah.
But the Jews are doing it, while they're in Babylon. So they've either decided to continue a practice that they would use with slaves. I don't know. It's perplexing to me, the examples there.
What do you think about piercings? The Bible kind of supports it. Doesn't.
Yes, when I think of the piercings, that tells me that there's something particular about the branding. It's not simply marking your body, because of course, if you think about it from one standpoint, if I decide to pierce my ear, I've disfigured my ear.
Right.
Okay, I've done something to it. Oh no, I'm doing it for another reason. If I pierce it. So if I'm marked, so in other words, if I pierce my ear, even in ancient Israel, you're doing it for a particular purpose, and it's different than the branding. That's the point. It's not merely changing your skin.
The motivation for it.
It's the motivation and what's behind it. So my argument is the original motivation for tattooing was because it was a mark of slavery. Now, why is it not mentioned that way? Because it was so obvious. And I use this silly example. And I think I might have even brought this up before with you in another one of our conversations. Like, if when I came over to your house, I was wearing an orange jumpsuit with an ankle bracelet on it, you'd probably say, "Hey, buddy, should I take you back? Where were you incarcerated?" "Oh no, I just like it. This is my favorite outfit." Your wife might say, "No, we're not feeding him today," or or something. And why? Because everyone knows what that means. When you and I were younger, it would be a black and white striped outfit.
That's true. In Florida, it would be like a orange jumpsuit.
Yeah. So the point is that nobody has to say anything today if somebody's wearing an orange jumpsuit with shackles on, like, "Hey, don't you want to change out of that?" And so why does anybody who's an escapee, why do they want to change their clothes immediately? So when the prohibition of tattooing is put here, no reason has to be given.
They already understood. Can I share one graphic here and give me your opinion about this?
Yeah, sure.
Based on what you're saying. So if we look at this graphic, you go one more less. So we have the culture of the Egyptians. They found tattoos and mummies.
Yep.
Likely meaning fertility, magic, religious devotion, which we already saw the marking of the god on the chest of that statue. Then you have Mesopotamian textual hints, branding, ownership, possibly protective. You were talking about?
Yes.
The Hittite legal codes, punishment, possible cult role.
I'll have to look that one up.
Me too. I read a little bit on it, but It wasn't that, precise. And then the Canaanites, biblical prohibition, mourning religious identity. Are
Now,
we sure about that one?
my argument is that my answer would be no. Is
Okay.
that there is no there's no mourning ritual that has tattooing in Canaanite culture. That was the whole point of
But the cutting of the flesh, yes.
the cutting of the flesh, yes. And of
Got it.
course, if you cut your flesh, it's permanent. You're going to have a scar, but scarring and tattooing are, though they're similar in terms of permanence, they're not similar in terms of, what they are, how
So,
you got your
so I
scar.
have a question. Could it be possible that, like you just said earlier, that they knew if I have a orange jumpsuit, that you were just in jail? That when the commandments in the book of Exodus 21 in regards to the Hebrew slave, that particular way of branding is the one acceptable to God,
Yeah,
not the one the Canaanites. We're assuming the Canaanites were doing the branding as well, Mesopotamians for
yeah.
slavery.
I'm going to guess.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's a contrast.
Yeah, yeah. That's probably a good point. Now, of course, we're not told because we're asking a question that is not necessarily the goal. The goal of the text is not to answer the question that we
Right.
have.
Well,
You know,
they knew the context. We don't. We're trying to
and
figure it out.
that's the whole point of this is that you and I are trying to arrive at that what that
Can you
context.
imagine if there was a Canaanite here and an Israelite from the time of all this stuff? They're looking at him. They will be looking at us like, why is taking you a whole hour to figure that out?
Yeah. Well, you think about it. That's exactly right. Is that but the same thing will happen to us. Let's say somebody in 5025 comes back here and
Yeah.
we're talking about all this stuff and say, wow, it took me 30 years to figure out, this. And in 5 minutes, you explained to me, why, what it means to, why somebody wears a MAGA hat, what that means.
Yeah.
This or that is, all this stuff. And so,
Well, this is really the reason why we so much about academia and researching, because we're trying to reconcile many things. Like, for example, the church today, although I think in many of the people, their hearts is on the right place. They want to do the right thing. But I
yeah.
think because of the disconnection between the whole overall context of the Bible, sometimes they're fragmented in their belief system. It's like it seems like some things don't make any sense. They do something, but they don't know where it comes from, and then you find out it comes from a different source than the Bible itself because we're not looking into the context of the Bible for clarity.
And even though that's been my primary vocation for all these years, I'm absolutely convinced I'm still a work in progress. And so,
Me
and
too. Me too.
talking to you, it stretches me and that this whole issue about Jews and Gentiles and the covenant, I'm working through all this.
A little stretch or a big stretch.
Yeah. Well, right
And
now,
we had a great conversation about that.
yeah,
Exodus. I'm sorry, Acts 11, 15. I
yeah.
thought we brought some good points. We did it in private because, you know, we're still trying to we're still trying to deal with certain topics in a way that could edify one another. And, but it would have been great for you all to listen to. You missed it. It
At
was
some
really
point,
cool.
yeah. And Rico, it's a heavy burden that I have to always be correct. And
Mhm.
so I'm joking, by the
I
way.
know you are. I know you are. Well, the thing about it is that all of us feel that we are grounded, that we
Yeah,
know what we're doing, and then we read something, and now you have to reevaluate everything you're doing.
yeah.
Like
And
example, the word kofel, which is from the third verb from kipel, atonement.
okay.
Man, have you ever traced that in the New Testament? It's fascinating. I mean, it's used everywhere in conjunction with the word aphesis, which is told you earlier about remission. And
And
it
is that,
actually means ransom. It's an
yeah,
exchange.
I actually wrote an article on the term ransom in Akkadian, which is similar to the Hebrew root deror. It's underarum,
Right.
means to
Deuteronomy
re
15, they're all.
yeah. And so it's the same root because we found it at Turka where I worked, and with another word
Where
that
can
was
I find that article so I can read it?
I'll send it to you. Um,
Is it in one of your books?
yes.
Which one?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um,
Well,
the
let me know
one,
later.
No, the one that was dedicated to Michael Astor. Um, do I have it right here? Because you have it somewhere.
Because that's actually the word for righteousness and justice.
Yeah. So this
The
is
whole releasing on the seventh year.
yes, the release. Yeah. And so they have it in Mesopotamia. They don't have it on the seventh year, and and this is going to lead us into maybe a future topic, and that really is about, I look at Milgram, and by the way, um, on page 1694, I'm not going to read it right now, but Milgram anticipates this whole thing about slavery in his own book. And like me, he finds he finds a Mesopotamian under every biblical rock.
Right.
And
Why do many of the scholars they always go to Mesopotamia before going to Egypt, although Israel lived in Egypt for so long?
um,
I've always wanted to ask that.
well, on a personal level, it's because of what I know. But other than that, it's because the ancestor came from Ur the Chaldees. In other words, Abraham is a Mesopotamian. He's through and through a Mesopotamian. I've been working on this article that I told you about in Genesis 15 about the fire pot and the torch that go through the animal parts. And I'm becoming more and more convinced now that it's not representing God. It's representing something out of Abraham's past that scared the bejeebies out of him. And I'm not quite done with it yet, but I'm finding this fire pot and torch all over the place, and there are always purification rituals everywhere, in homes, in the temple, when you're trying to exorcise demons, when you have a nasty dog at your doorstep, if you have a bad omen, you're using a torch and a censer to get rid of the thing. And when those two things go through the animal parts, it's because this Mesopotamian guy, Abraham, who's basically just 3 chapters away from being a Mesopotamian. And so, do you think he really understands what's going on? No. Uh, I think God is very graciously and slowly bringing Abraham along. He's still Abram, by the way,
Yeah.
but you think about it. He doesn't stop him at the beginning and say, Abram, I'm the only God, and so stop doing all the things that you're doing and worship me. He says, no. In fact, he starts him off by saying, hey, I know you don't know me, but I'm going to give you a great deal. You're going to be blessed beyond your wildest imagination. All you need to do is to go to a land I show you. I'm not telling you where you're going. Will you do it? And he says, yeah, okay. I mean, does he know what
Yeah.
he's doing? No. He does a bunch of stupid stuff in 13 with his wife when he goes into Egypt. And then, but the point is that he's being led on a little bit at a time because he's a Mesopotamian. I'm convinced he's an Amorite, by the way.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so, and so he's through and through a Mesopotamian. He's 100% Mesopotamian. In fact, my wife and I, we just noticed on Amazon Prime, they had a movie about Abram. It's through Angel Studios, and it's not something I would recommend to everybody, but it's a reproduction of what Abraham does. In other words, what led up to him. It's the backstory of Abraham going and to ready to sacrifice his son, and it was actually well done. And so what do they do? The backstory is Abram's a Mesopotamian Baru priest. They don't say Baru priest, but he's a divination priest. And God just sort of pulls him out of that. I'm thinking, actually, that works pretty well. I mean, it doesn't mean it's true, but this would make sense that he's deep into Mesopotamian civilization, as deep as you can get. Uh, I suppose kind of like Paul having his revelation. The analogy is not perfect, obviously, because but the point is, Abraham is basically being told everything you ever knew, I'm going to turn upside down on its head.
Yeah. With
You know,
that being said, can we say then that Genesis 23 in regards to the binding of Isaac? No, it's 22. The binding of Isaac is actually something that he would have understood either in the Canaanite culture or the Mesopotamian, because we
yeah,
know the worship of Moloch, they used to sacrifice their firstborns.
yeah,
Uh, so talk about turning your world upside down from
Yeah.
the way they thought to the way God wants them to think.
And I'm wondering whether when Paul is talking about this in what is it, Romans 4, he says, in hope, it was the King James, in hope against hope he believed, which I think has usually been, the commentators argue that he's trying to say in Greek, he believed against all reason. In other words, he believed God even though it didn't make any sense to him in his own environment. Um,
Well, that kind of makes sense because, like you
yeah,
said earlier, he is leaving a country, and but people don't realize when you leave your father's house, he was not just a regular guy with no money and
yeah,
no status.
yeah,
I mean, he has status.
yeah, a lot
He
of
lost a
status.
lot.
Yeah. So I look at it this way. When people says, "Oh, I don't accept that thing or that thing in the Bible because it doesn't make sense," and my argument, that's exactly why I believe it, because I'm not God. And if everything made sense to me, then that would mean I would understand the mind of God, and I don't. In fact, so I'm going to follow it even though it doesn't make any sense to me in some respects. And
Well, I
what
mean, don't you think that our faith, the way we believe it, to a regular person is illogical? We
well,
believe it. We
yeah,
believe in the Messiah we never met.
yeah,
I recently, 25 years ago, learned his name is Yeshua in the Hebrew. I didn't know that. And then I own my trips to Israel and Turkey and Greece. Now I'm learning cultural backgrounds. I have no idea. It's illogical that we are thinking that there's a God we've never seen.
yeah,
We never heard his voice, and yet he resurrected a person that we never saw in a
yeah,
culture that we never belong to, in a language we don't even know. I
yeah.
mean, that's faith.
And what is Tertullian? What was his argument? I believe in the resurrection because it's impossible.
Yeah.
Now in the context, he's showing the illogic of the whole thing. And but I think the point is well taken. Is that we believe in something even though it might even go against our innate logic, uh, because I'm not going to make my own logic my God. That's the whole
Right.
point. Is that if all I could do, because if I did that, what happens when I'm wrong, which happens just about every day,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, you know,
Cool
and
stuff.
so it's
Cool
very,
stuff, man. That's
yeah,
that's really fun today.
yes.
So your conclusion on the matters of tattoos, everyone is free to go and do them now. Is that what you're saying?
Well, but even I look at it this way, even if you're a Gentile and you don't accept anything with the covenant, let's just argue that for a second.
Okay.
I I would still be hesitant because it says that there, and even if I felt I had the freedom to do it, I think you would cause an outsider to stumble.
I would
So
agree that
I
it should not be
wouldn't
allowed.
so I wouldn't even go near it, even if I thought it was a conscience issue. On the other hand, you know, I think because even though I'm much older than you are, a whole decade, but the whole point is that because of our life experience, you know, in our original cultural context, we wouldn't even have dreamed. I mean, we would be scared to death to do a tattoo. And like you were just talking about your
Yeah.
dad, you know,
Right.
you know,
Well, I do. I've been doing Filipino martial arts for like 23 years.
yeah,
And they normally do tribal tattoos.
yeah,
Man, they always ask me how come I never did it because I have a very high rank. And normally the people with the high rank, they get them done. It's
yeah,
a sign of status within the whole system. And
sure,
I told them no because it's actually connected with averting evil.
yeah,
And I remember one guy in
oh
the
yeah,
system. Yeah, and the guy that was he was in the same system of martial arts that I was. And my son was with me, by the way. It was perfect because he was like 10 years old, 11 years old. And I was teaching him about not all this stuff. And the guy was doing a demonstration about tribal art tattoos. And he actually mentioned it. As we were listening, my son is standing next to me. And the guy says, well, our traditions in the Philippines is that when you get a tribal tattoo, not only are you like trying to show your loyalty to the tribe, but it's also to avert demons. And my
yeah,
son looked at me, he went like, hey, you did tell me that. So I gained a lot of credibility with him on that one. So there's a lot of things that people do with tattoos
yeah,
that Wenham in a way has a point in which if we are now in the image of God and you put something on your body that would actually be dedicated because we've been sealed by the Spirit of God, that would give credit and honor to anything, especially the dead. That's not
Yeah.
acceptable to the Lord.
So I would want to be far removed from it. Even if I thought I had the freedom, I would not want uh, my brother to stumble.
I'm
And
with you.
so,
I agree with you 100%.
you know.
And specifically when it says at the end of that command, I am the Lord your
Oh
God.
yeah.
Like,
Like in case you forgot where this
yeah,
is coming from, let me remind you again every
that's
few
right.
verses, you know.
Let me read it one more time and then we finish up here.
Yeah.
It says 28, it says, and you shall not make any slash in your body for a dead person, nor shall you make on yourselves a tattoo's mark. I am the Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, that's good enough for me.
Yes. And like I said, all I've done here is to try to put it in a context to understand what it meant to an Israelite, when this was being written, and rather than taking it out of its context. In the same way that we've talked about Deuteronomy 24 before, is that was a very particular law about a very particular issue that had divorce in it. But the rabbis, in many respects, made it a generic divorce law. And so, in the same way here, tattoo has always been guilty by association with the previous, phrase about
Slashing.
slashing and marking. My answer is no, it's not. But that doesn't lessen its power in terms of it being um, a negative statement. It's still a negative statement for a different meaning. And somebody might argue, oh, we don't do it for slavery anymore. And my
But
answer is so.
last point, I don't want to take too much of your time. I know you're giving me a lot
That's
extra.
all
I
right.
appreciate it. Um, but when I was in college there, the African American sororities,
Yeah.
they have a branding of their,
Interesting.
it's actually a branding, it looks like a branding.
Wow.
And I just thought about that,
How
because I was very well, I mean, I was known in college for baseball. So I hung out a lot of the sororities and so,
sure.
seniorities or whatever they want to call it. And they had the branding, the African American ones, they always had a branding of their logo. So whatever they're doing. It's kind
And
of
this is
interesting.
what is this Northern California?
I was in San Francisco, Northern California, but
Yeah.
I know they're normally some of them do. I'm not saying
Yeah,
all
but
of them, some of them.
everything's understood. If it's Northern California, it's
Yeah,
the
right.
yeah.
Professor, thank you so much. What do you want to talk about next time?
Well, I'm thinking I'll look into it. I've got a couple of articles, but once you started mentioning something about the covering and there's an Akkadian word kaparu, which means to cover, and it's also used in their animal offering rituals. And so I got a couple articles I might send to you by Joanne Scurlock that talk about these. In other words, there are there are very interesting correspondences in Mesopotamian sacrificial rituals and with animals that I think help us understand the biblical ones quite well. And
So,
so
so
um,
should we talk about that next week?
I think we can do that.
Awesome. So
We,
I got one last question in regards to that topic.
yeah,
Gofel, which is one of the root words for kipel, right? Keeper,
yeah,
atonement. The ark of Moses, a little ark, is
yes,
built the same one as the ark of Noah.
yes, right. Uh,
So
the,
I'd like
the
to know
writer,
more about, huh?
yeah, the writer obviously has not done that by accident. That's definitely on purpose.
So let's go from there.
And so and of course when Paul uses, what does he use? Hilasterion, which doesn't
Right.
have the exact meaning, but it's probably the best word he could find to use it. But it's obvious that he's connecting that word. That's the word that Septuagint used for it um, when it was trying to figure out what word to use in Greek for the cover. And so, yeah,
You mean in Romans 3, 22 and 20, 24 and 25?
yes, yes,
Yeah, that word is actually mercy seat.
yes, okay.
It's a Yom Kippur language.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's what Paul's definitely bringing up. And so, and of course, who are the Romans? They're obviously a mixture of Jewish and Gentile Christians. And so he's
Yeah.
bringing with them.
Well,
All
we'll get together next time. Go Yankees, and Judge is really hitting it out of the ballpark, while
right.
your man Otani is over there hanging out. He has a good reason to take a vacation. He has a brand new baby, so God bless his family,
Well,
and he can
he's
take
already.
all year off if he wants to.
Oh, he's already back. He already
Oh
he came
man,
back
I mean, I
yesterday.
was hoping he could take another 6 months, taking vacation because his baby, he spent time with him.
He's 2 days off. He had a girl. He said it's dad power. He's ready. He's ready.
That's great.
Cocked and loaded.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for
Right.
joining me. As always, thank you, Professor, for the great conversation and dialogue. And I pray, listen, guys, go to my Wisdom and Torah page, hit the subscribe button, hit the like, and give me a thumbs up so we can continue to, share these teachings with as many people. And I'm going to continue to have my friend and my brother here, Mark, as far and as long as he wants me, he lets me, bring him on. And by the way, consider this, guys. Professor, not once have ever asked me for one thing. He's donating his time. Please subscribe to his Facebook page. Go and buy his books. Find a way to support him in that way. And I'm very grateful to him, not only for his knowledge, but more so his friendship.